Hi everyone, here we go. Session 4, where we are going to talk about equitable access to educators, to excellent educators, no less. So I know we talked about the equity plan when we were in person, but it's pretty central to the work that we're doing in this class. So I just wanted to go over it again a little bit because a lot has transpired since then. So the key idea of this Massachusetts equity plan, which was created in 2015, there's a 2017 update that's really exciting. The idea is that all students should have access to equitable educators. And what they say about this as the goal is, and this is straight from Desi's own mouth, where in the past we focused almost exclusively on the distribution of teachers, now we're focused on students' learning experiences, and particularly their assignment to excellent educators. So in this revised equity plan, DESE approaches the prevalence of and access to excellent educators from several entry points. So they're talking about how it's like across the career continuum, there's preparation, there's licensure, and there's development. That it's not a sort of one stop and you're done situation. And because of the new data pieces, that they're also looking a lot more about the impact of the educator on the student. So looking at the effectiveness there. And as they had before, it's not just like a one measure situation. We're not just looking at the MCAS, we're looking at a whole range of sort of how we can look at the educator quality so that all students, but especially students with greatest need, have this equitable access. Because again, as we've talked about, equity and equitable access is not about everyone having the same thing, it's about everyone having access to what they need. So making sure that it's not the situation which is now, which is the opposite of that, which is the students with the highest needs have the least access. So in this equity plan, there's 4 major groups that they're looking for. Students of color, students with disabilities, low-income students, which they identify as students from poverty, not students living in poverty, which is a slight distinction, and English learners. And in this process, they're looking for 3 characteristics of educators when they're looking at what is an excellent educator. They're looking for the experience, they're looking for the effectiveness, and they're looking for the preparation. So what we know is that by the numbers, there are nearly twice as many first-year teachers who are teaching in schools with a high percentage of students of color. And so the way that the equity plan is recommending to address this is developing educator preparation partnerships. So figuring out how to develop educators into these hard to staff roles so that first year educators are better prepared than they currently are now, so that it doesn't take, I think we all know that as educators, so much of what you learn happens in the first few years on the job. And so how can we better get people ready to sort of hit the ground running? There's obviously going to be things that we learn as we keep going, but how can we reduce that sort of curve? And DESE has a range of different sort of ways that we can look at this. They have a district pipeline advisory, they have a leveraging partnerships webinar, all those sort of pieces. Also, strategically recruiting and supporting student teaching placements. So really, when you're thinking about who is coming in as a student teacher, thinking about what they would be like as a new hire. So how can we turn those pieces into really strategic recruitment and hiring efforts? Because that's another way to get teachers more prepared, right? Is you're thinking of them as being your teacher, they get a handle on some of the school culture piece right when they're coming to your school, and then they're ready to hit the ground running a lot more. I'm really overusing that metaphor of hit the ground running. I apologize. And then strengthening the mentoring and induction so that building within schools and across the state these programs to really support early teachers. Having specific programs for mentoring and induction for teachers of color can also be really helpful, making sure that the teachers that you want are the teachers that are ready, that your district is already prepared to support. I think that very often we get so bogged down in the day to day and the moment to moment of what's going on that it's really hard to um, really do this prep work. But that's what this course is all about. So thinking about DESE has some reports that can help you look at the sort of quality and the consistency of teacher candidates from different places. And so that can be a helpful guide on this preparation step, because really looking at who the candidates are, because most people who complete teaching training programs do teach within 15 minutes of where they were prepared, can be, it means that really looking at this as a resource can as you keep going. So effectiveness. So the stat that we're looking at is that low-income students are 61% more likely to have educators read it unsatisfactory or needs improvement on the assessment scales. And so DESE's first suggestion is to calibrate evaluators, which I think a lot of us know what that means, but it's basically collaborating to make sure that we all have the same goal in mind and that we all know how to tell whether we've met that goal and what steps are needed to meet that goal and where we're at with those things. And they offer a lot of resources around that and recommend specifically doing some calibration around equitable practices and inclusive educator practices. Distributing the leadership, so supporting teacher leadership in your school culture, creating and sustaining sort of teacher leadership roles. There's obviously programs that are designed towards building teacher leadership that are like advanced grad study courses, but figuring out what you can do within your school to build that. Doing distributed leadership, DESE has a range of resources because it can be a really big shift for a school to sort of move into an approach that has a lot more peer mentors. I know that for me, a lot of the schools I'm in are doing some level of peer mentoring, and I think that a piece of it is also supporting the mentors themselves, right? Because what you don't want is a culture that just burns out your effective and strong teachers. So how to expand this impact, how to provide supports for people on both sides of it, how to make being in these leadership positions beneficial for everyone, and how to create a culture really of shared responsibility for all students' outcomes. And then the final one under effectiveness that they're looking at is really developing these common measures that are curriculum aligned, really tracking things systematically, helping ensure that students can't fall through the cracks, looking at continuous improvements. Again, not waiting for the annual assessment, ensuring that as the year goes by that we're checking to make sure students are meeting standards and frameworks. There's a review tool that DESE has available to help educators ensure that their assessments are assessing the content as needed. There is they provide support also on creating parameters that allow all students a chance to demonstrate growth and that keep high standards for all students while not making them inaccessible. And in terms of the teacher, they have equity goals for each of these. So the equity goal of the equitable and inclusive calibration, an equity goal of ensuring that the teacher leadership that you're raising up isn't just who's been there the longest, it's who's really effective at working with students with a wide range of needs. And when you're doing professional development, thinking about equity and inclusive practices, think about universal design for learning, think about poverty-informed education. So how do we sort of keep building equity into a piece of each of these educator uh, growth elements? So then I wanted to talk a little, now we've talked some about the state, of what the federal approach to this is. So this is from a report, the links are at the bottom. There's two different reports from the same time period from the Reform Support Network, which is part of the Department of Education. And so their assessment of what the root causes of inequitable access to effective educators is our ineffective leadership. So they're saying that basically strong leaders get talent and strong leaders keep talent. So principals of schools with high numbers of effective teachers retained are stronger at communicating expectations and making teachers feel supported and requiring effective teaching, basically. Adverse working conditions. So obviously it's going to be harder to keep access to excellent teachers when you've got overloaded workload, low levels of parent involvement, student conduct issues, unsafe schools, poorly located schools. So teachers at low performing schools tend to be much less satisfied with working conditions than colleagues at high achieving schools. So, I mean, and it's like twice. The colleagues at the high achieving schools are literally double rates of satisfaction, which is a challenge, right? Everything's really pretty circular, and there's some answers that I'm going to propose from these same studies next, but they're not easy answers. These everything really builds on itself. So a lack of upward mobility. So if you've got high performing teachers who want to sort of stretch themselves and take on new challenges but don't want to leave their classroom, don't want to become administrators, that can also cause high performing teachers to leave. Teachers with lower job satisfaction were more likely to report being interested in taking on additional classroom responsibilities. So sometimes people actually want to do more despite how overtaxed they might be. Inadequate compensation. Do I really need to say more about this? Except for that highly effective teachers are twice as likely as ineffective teachers to say the part of why they're leaving is inadequate compensation. Effectiveness blind human capital management, which is like the creepiest, most dystopian way to say that districts not being concerned about whether they're retaining effective versus ineffective teachers are going to have less effective teachers. Students are going to, or teachers are going to leave more often. So even though schools have a 3 in 4 chance of replacing a low performing teacher with a new teacher who's going to be more effective immediately, which is pretty stunning. And productivity of peer teachers. So people join people who are at their level. So teachers who transfer schools tend to go somewhere where average teacher quality is similar to their own. High performing teachers go to high performing schools with other high performing teachers. Poor performing teachers go to schools with other poor performing teachers. So I think that really trying to look at those pieces is what this next of strategic solutions is trying to look at. So creating a strategic staffing initiative, strategic plans for workforce planning. So really trying to get a sense in advance of where are our gaps going to be, both physically and sort of support wise. What skill deficits do we have? What are our broader labor market trends? What's the student population growth? We don't have to wait until we have every student enrolled necessarily to figure out what we're likely to need if we're looking for getting the best teachers in schools. So this could happen on a state level is the recommendation. So the states can create an overarching workforce plan that they co-develop with educators. And then differentiating roles and teachers for high performing roles and titles for high performing teachers and extending their reach. So really sort of that like social value is valuing, but also economic valuing to really get these teacher leaders to be supportive. Flexible school models were recommended under this, really trying to make it so that everyone's able to use all of their skills in the most effective ways. Improving the supply of teacher to high need schools, so creating teacher residency programs in these high need schools. I think we all know Boston has one of those. I know there's some others around. Recruiting college students to teach in high need schools through loan repayment. Let's all be clear, this is the federal government's recommendations. I'm not necessarily in support of or against any of these. But so what does federal loan repayment look like in a situation like this? There's already a federal student aid education loan situation where you can get $17,500 forgiven if you're teaching in a high need school for 5 consecutive years versus in the National Health Service Corps with like nurses and physicians also that they can receive $50,000 for 2 years of service. So there's a pretty big gap there. $3,500 a year and you need to be there for 5 years versus, and you only get it at the end, versus $25,000 a year, be there for 2 years, get it at the end. So just really looking at what that might balance out to be. Establishing performance contracts with high performing teacher preparation programs, because like it was like the DESE information was saying, like we know who's preparing teachers really well, right? That information is there. So how can schools who are in need of really high performing teachers get connected to those in advance? And then establishing effective peer cohorts. If we know that high performing teachers go towards high performing teachers, like how can we create more setups like that within the schools? Improve management of human capital. I'm just trying to be not weirded out by that language. So sort of creating teacher placement policies that prevent smart hiring and retention, stopping those. Because right now there's a lot of things in place that don't allow for really thoughtful hiring of teachers. Um, is employing strategies to retain effective teachers and remove ineffective teachers. I know that we have a lot of barriers to being able to just switch out teachers willy-nilly, and there's a lot of good reasons for those. But this is also just saying that district and school leaders can employ a number of tactics to encourage high-performing teachers to stay in or move to the classrooms that most need them, and persistent low performers to leave the classroom. And then place proven leaders in high-need schools and providing with incentives and other resources they wouldn't have access to, so that the placement would be considered a reward for their performance. Like increased autonomy in a high-need school, a school leadership career pathway, things like that. Holding district and school leaders accountable for teacher distribution, longitudinal data systems to track who gets what teachers, requiring people to be accurate and honest in identifying their low performers, holding principals accountable for teacher quality distribution through evaluation, and then compensating excellent teachers and leaders in high-need schools. So they're really talking about differential pay, right? Recognizing that the job of a teacher in a high-need school is often more demanding than a teacher in a low-need school, and right now they're often getting paid less. So how can we sort of work to shift that, either both including increases in base salary, incentives to switch schools, if you prove you're highly effective at least 2 years in a row, getting an increase in the base salary. Highly effective teachers in lowest performing schools can get additional bonuses. The research has shown that pay alone is not enough to get highly effective teachers moved to high need schools, so they recommend coupling it with other incentives. And so if everyone can just click away from this, pause this, and watch this video, Why Open a School to Close a Prison, and then come back. So what I'd love, now that you're back, if you haven't watched the video, here's another couple seconds that you have an opportunity to pause it. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I am hoping that you will write and send me a reflection about, ideally, your initial response to this video in relation especially to thinking about the pieces we read about the empathy gap and the seeing Black students as older in the readings. So I'm interested in this, opening schools to close a prison, and how this relates to who's in schools and how kids are being seen in schools. If you have not read the reading, that's fine. Just write about it later or don't, but just reflect on the video. But if you have read the reading, I'm interested in what connections, if any, you see between the empathy gap work and this open a school, close a prison piece. Okay, that is all for today. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to reading what you guys have to say about this.